Hey, everybody out there, I have an announcement today and a special episode featuring our good friend, Professor James Early of the Key Battles of American History podcast. You know, James is a longtime friend of the show. He's a personal friend. I see him fairly frequently. But today I'm going to feature an episode of his on war, conflict, victory, and defeat. These are all aspects of life that some may have to face. This was true for the various groups of the Sioux Tribe. On today's bonus episode from Key Battles of American History, we're going to join James Early as he discusses the multiple wars that took place between 1862 and 1890, collectively known as the Sioux Wars. Enjoy this episode. If you want to learn more, you can look for links to all of James's episodes and much more in the show notes, and I will talk to you soon.
And now, a word from our sponsors.
War has played a key role in the history of the United States, from the nation's founding right down to the present. War made the U.S. independent, kept it together, increased its size, and established it as a global superpower. Understanding America's wars is essential for understanding American history. Welcome to Key Battles of American History, a podcast in which we discuss American history through the lens of the most important battles of America's wars. Here is your host, James Early.
Hello and welcome to another special episode of Key Battles of American History. This is your host, James Early. As always, this is yet another episode in our series of episodes that have been commissioned by members of Early's Raiders, my Patreon group that supports the podcast. This particular episode was requested by Major Alex Calabrese, longtime supporter of the podcast, and it is on the Sioux Wars, meaning the Indian tribe, the Sioux. So again, this is a very high level, 10,000 foot level flyover like I always do. It won't be a very long episode. This is like anything I do. You could do a whole series on this, but just going to give you the high points. Hopefully that'll whet your appetite enough to do some more research and reading on your own. Now, I want to make one thing clear up front. You always have to say this when you talk about Native Americans. I'm going to use the terms Indians, Native Americans, Indigenous peoples, maybe natives from time to time, interchangeably. I'm not placing any value on any of these terms. I'm not using any of these in a judgmental sense, just for variety's sake. All of them are used in scholarly literature even today. So just wanted to get that out of the way in advance. Okay, so let's talk about this now. We're going to give a little bit of a background to general conflict between Native Americans and white Americans, and then we are also going to look very quickly at each of the individual wars, which collectively make up what are generally called the Sioux Wars. So let's do it. From the moment the white settlers from Europe arrived on the shores of North America, there was conflict between the new arrivals and the indigenous residents of the continent. During the 17th and 18th centuries, white settlers slowly but surely deprived Native Americans of their land, pushing them further and further west. This process picked up steam after the establishment of the United States of America in the late 1700s. George Washington, the first American president, tried to help the Indians as best he could, but he was unable to stop the efforts of land-hungry whites. In an effort to keep peace between white settlers and Native Americans, Washington sent the U.S. Army into the then western lands of the U.S. But this only led to even bloodier clashes that ultimately resulted in the expulsion of most indigenous peoples from the so-called Old Northwest. The Old Northwest is what today in the U.S. we would call the Midwest, so the parts that were the Northwest Territory. So we're talking about modern-day Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, Iowa, Wisconsin, parts of Minnesota, Michigan, those parts. Now, after George Washington left office, American Indian situation further deteriorated. As historian Peter Cozzens writes in his book, The Earth is Weeping, quote, "After George Washington, no president lost much sleep over Indian rights. Indeed, the executive branch led the way in divesting the Indians of their homelands," end quote. This was especially true during the presidency of Andrew Jackson, who signed the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which led to the later forcible removal of the so-called 5 civilized tribes, and those are the Cherokees, Choctaws, Chickasaws, Creeks, and part of the Seminoles, westward into Indian Territory, which is roughly modern-day Oklahoma. It was bigger at first, but it eventually became what is now Oklahoma. Jackson also enforced the removal of most of the remaining Indians of the Old Northwest to lands west of the Mississippi River. Jackson and other American leaders hoped to make the Mississippi River the permanent boundary between whites and natives. And to maintain this frontier between 1817 and 1847, the U.S. government built a series of forts in a north-south line from Minnesota to northwest Louisiana. To the west of this line of forts lived not only the Indians who had been expelled from the eastern parts of the U.S., but also a large number of tribes who had long made their home on the West Coast, in the Southwest, in the Rocky Mountain areas, and in the Great Plains. To these latter tribes, the Plains Indians, we will turn a little later in our story. Now, the so-called permanent frontier proved to be far from permanent for a variety of reasons. First, the promise of fertile land in California and Oregon motivated thousands of white Americans in the East to migrate to the West Coast. In addition to this, the U.S.'s 1845 annexation of Texas led to war with Mexico, which in turn resulted in the addition of huge swaths of Mexican territory, including the modern-day states of California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and Utah, plus parts of other states, to the U.S. And if you want to learn more about this, of course, I did a series with Sean McIver on the Mexican-American War in this very podcast, so check that out if you haven't already listened. Now, these newly acquired lands proved to be a magnet for many thousands of white Americans seeking land and a new start on life. The discovery of gold in California in 1848 drew even more white settlers, so much so that by 1860 there were more whites in California than there were Native Americans in the entire American West. At first, there were few open conflicts between Western Indians and white settlers, but the settlers' unquenchable thirst for land, together with their lack of respect for Indian claims to their traditional homelands, made conflict inevitable. The U.S. government's lack of a coherent Indian policy did not help the situation. The antebellum U.S. Army was tiny, and it needed time to build forts in the West. For their part, Native American tribes in the West were poorly positioned to resist white encroachment on their lands. As Peter Cozzens writes, quote, "The Indians did not perceive the white onslaught for the apocalyptic threat that it was. But even if they had, the Indians of the American West had no common identity, no sense of Indianness, and they were too busy fighting one another to give their undivided attention to the new threat." End quote. The overwhelming majority of tribes divided into two factions. One that wanted to work with the whites and adopt their ways, at least to some extent, and another that preferred to hold on to their traditional beliefs and practices while resisting the whites by armed force. The divided state of the Western Indian tribes played right into the U.S. Army and government's hands. Let us now return to the Plains Indians. It is tempting to believe that all of the tribes who claimed this region as home in the mid-1800s had lived there for centuries. But this is simply not true. For, as Cozzens writes, quote, "A grand irony of the Great Plains is that none of the tribes with which the Army would clash were native to the lands they claimed. All had been caught up in a vast migration precipitated by white settlement of the East. In a very real sense, then, the wars that were to come between the Indians and the government for the Great Plains, the seat of the longest and bloodiest struggles, would represent a clash of emigrant peoples. A way of life was lost, but it had not been of long duration." End quote. Of all the Plains Indian tribes, none is as well known today, and none was as powerful in the mid-19th century than the Sioux. And the Sioux is not their original name. That's a name that was given to them by the French, but we'll go with it. Originally a woodland people of the present-day upper Midwest, the Sioux migrated westward along with many other tribes as white Americans moved into their lands. Over time, the Sioux divided into three major groups, including the Dakotas, who settled near the Minnesota River in modern-day Minnesota, the Nakotas, who took up residence east of the Missouri River, and the well-known Lakotas, who moved the furthest west, ending up in the northern plains into what is today the states of the Dakotas, northwest Nebraska, and northeastern Wyoming. The Lakotas, who comprised nearly half of the Sioux Nation, further divided into 7 tribes: the Oglalas, the Brulés, the Miniconjou, Two Kettles, Hunkpapas, Blackfeet, and San Arc. The Lakota fully adopted the Plains horse culture in the 1700s, as did those Nakota who lived on the plains. After the U.S.'s absorption of the Mexican Cession, the U.S. government took on 3 major tasks related to the Western Indians. They were, again in Peter Cozzens's words, quote, to provide military protection to the immigrant roads and to the burgeoning white settlements, to extinguish Indian land titles, and to develop a humane policy to provide for the divested Indians. End quote. Other than the U.S. Army, the main governmental institution charged with carrying out these responsibilities was the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which had been founded in 1824. Realizing that the Plains Indian tribes were under great pressure due to the explosion of white settlers from the eastern U.S. in 1851, Indian Affairs agent Tom Fitzpatrick brought together 10,000 Northern Plains Indians at Fort Laramie, Wyoming. There, many of the chiefs signed the Fort Laramie Treaty, under which the Indians agreed not to war among themselves, to allow the U.S. government to build roads and forts in their territories, and to not harm white settlers traveling through their countries. In return, the government pledged to protect the Indians from whites who would despoil their lands, which it had neither the will nor the power to do, and to make annual payments to the tribes for 50 years, which was later reduced to 10 years. 2 years later, leaders of the Southern Plains tribes signed a similar treaty at Fort Atkinson in southern Wisconsin. Despite the treaties, conflict often broke out between the U.S. Army and Indians, usually due to rash actions taken by individual U.S. soldiers or Indian warriors. One well-known example occurred in August 1854, when a young U.S. Army lieutenant named John Grattan picked a fight with a Brulé chief named Smoking Bear. In the skirmish that resulted, Conquering Bear was mortally wounded, and 29 soldiers were killed. In retaliation, a Brulé war party attacked a passing stagecoach and killed 3 passengers. In response to this, the War Department sent Colonel William Harney to punish the Brulé. In September 1856, Harney and his soldiers attacked a Brulé camp, killing half the warriors and taking most of the women and children captive. In these events, we see a pattern that would be repeated all too many times over the next 3.5 decades. In other words, we would see one relatively small fight, often instigated by a single bad actor, would be followed by a larger revenge attack by the other side, which led to an even larger retribution, and so on. Conflicts between Native Americans and whites broke out all over the American West, but since this episode deals exclusively with the Sioux Wars, I will limit this remaining discussion to fights between that tribe and the U.S. Army. The wars between the U.S. Army and the Sioux Nation during this period can be divided into several major conflicts. We'll start with the Dakota War of 1862. By 1862, much of the reservation that the government had granted the Dakota Sioux, who, as you may recall, lived in Minnesota, modern-day Minnesota, of course, the land had been taken by whites. Much of the reservation was whittled away. Many of these whites had used liquor and other goods to separate the Indians from their annuities. On the reservation, hunger and despair prevailed. On August 17, 1862, which, by the way, in passing, is exactly 1 month before the Battle of Antietam, back east, but on that date, a group of Dakota warriors, frustrated from returning from a hunt empty-handed, killed 6 white settlers. Peter Cozzens describes what happened next. Quote, faced with certain government retaliation, the chiefs chose to fight, and Dakota war parties butchered hundreds of settlers before Union troops. Commanded by General John Pope, fresh from his resounding defeat at Second Bull Run, drove them onto the plains in the arms of their Nakota kinsmen. In pitched battles in 1863 and 1864, the Army crippled the Dakotas and the Nakotas who, less a small number who escaped to Canada or joined the Lakotas, afterwards submitted to reservation life. End quote. By the way, the side note about General Pope, that wasn't in the original text. I added that in. Couldn't resist. By the end of the war, 358 settlers had been killed, plus 77 soldiers and 29 volunteer militia. The total number of Dakota casualties is unknown. In less than 6 weeks, a military commission sentenced 303 Dakota men to death. President Abraham Lincoln reviewed the convictions and approved death sentences for 39 out of the 303. And on December 26, 1862, 38 of these were hanged in Mankato, Minnesota, with one getting a reprieve. This was the largest one-day mass execution in American history. The United States Congress abolished the Eastern Dakota and Ho-Chunk or Winnebago reservations in Minnesota and declared their treaties null and void. Now we move to the second major conflict between the Sioux and the U.S. Army, and that is Red Cloud's War, which occurred from 1866 to 1868. Named after the influential Oglala Lakota leader Red Cloud, this conflict was primarily fought in present-day Wyoming and Montana. In 1862, gold was discovered in southwestern Montana. A frontier entrepreneur named John Bozeman soon established a trail to the site, the so-called Bozeman Trail. The trail went right through Lakota Sioux hunting grounds. A great number of white settlers traveled along the trail, so many that they thoroughly depleted the hunting grounds, nearly causing the northern Oglalas to starve in the winter of 1865-66. The U.S. Army built several forts to protect the Bozeman Trail, but the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes fiercely resisted the intrusion. Red Cloud's forces successfully attacked and besieged U.S. military forts, killing about 200 soldiers and settlers, with, again, Indian losses unknown, and forcing the government to negotiate. The resulting Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, and this is the second Fort Laramie Treaty, we've mentioned an earlier one previously, recognized Sioux control over the Black Hills and the Powder River country, which were seen as not valuable to the government anyway. I should mention, too, that this hunting trail, this Sioux hunting trail, the Sioux themselves had actually just taken it by force from the Crow. So again, we see that these Indian tribes were not stationary. They hadn't lived in these places where they lived for centuries. They'd moved around themselves quite a bit and fought among each other. Okay, let's now go to the third major conflict between the Sioux and the U.S. government, and that is the Great Sioux War, perhaps the most well-known one, 1876 to 77. This conflict, again, the most well-known one between the U.S. Army and the Sioux Nation, included the Battle of the Little Bighorn, also known as Custer's Last Stand. The war's origin can be traced to the discovery of gold in the Black Hills, which led to increased white settlement and a violation of the Fort Laramie Treaty. The U.S. government demanded that the Sioux move to reservations, but many resisted. In response, the U.S. sent an army to force the Indians to move. This army included the U.S. 7th Cavalry, led by the celebrated and flamboyant Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. Prior to the battle that ensued, Custer made three major mistakes. The first of these was failing to wait for the columns led by General Alfred Terry, General George Crook, and Colonel John Gibbon, which were headed to the same objective area to join him. Custer's second mistake was not conducting a proper reconnaissance of the Indians' encampment. Had he done so, he would have known that his force was inadequate for the task of surprising and defeating the Indians. Custer's third mistake was the division of his force into three smaller units who were unable to support each other. Finally, Custer held on to an arrogant belief that his force alone could defeat the Indians on its own without support. As a result of Custer's mismanagement of his forces, Lakota and Cheyenne warriors, led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, defeated Custer's forces at the Battle of Little Bighorn, which occurred on June 25th and 26th, 1876. Killing Custer and over 260 of his men. But despite the Sioux triumph at Little Bighorn, the Army eventually prevailed, and under the terms of the agreement of 1877, which was signed on February 28th of that year, the government officially annexed Sioux land and permanently established Indian reservations to which the Sioux were confined. Overall, in the Great Sioux War, about 300 soldiers and other whites were killed compared to 265 Native Americans. It is worthy to mention that traditionally American military and historians place the Lakota at the center of the story, especially because of their numbers. But some Native Americans believe the Cheyenne were the primary target of the American campaign, and they prefer to call this war the Great Cheyenne War. And now we move to the final major conflict between the Sioux Nation and the United States. And indeed, it's the final major conflict between any Native American tribe and white Americans in the U.S. Army and government, and that is the Ghost Dance War, 1890. This conflict was a culmination of tensions fueled by the suppression of Native American religious practices, such as the introduction of the ghost dance movement among the Sioux. The ghost dance movement, initiated by the Paiute religious leader Wovoka, also known as Jack Wilson, offered hope of restoration of Indians' traditional way of life and the removal of white settlers. The U.S. government responded to the ghost dance movement by dispatching troops to quell the perceived threat. The Army occupied Lakota Sioux reservations, causing fear, confusion, and resistance among the Lakota. And eventually, before 1890, Sitting Bull was killed by Indian Agency police. And the occupation of the reservations ultimately resulted in the Wounded Knee Massacre, wherein the 7th Cavalry, that's Custer's old unit, killed over 250 Lakota, primarily unarmed women, children, and elders at Wounded Knee Creek on December 29, 1890. The end of the Ghost Dance War is usually dated January 15, 1891, when Lakota ghost dancing leader Kicking Bear decided to meet with U.S. officials. However, the U.S. government continued to use the threat of violence to suppress the ghost dance at the Lakota reservations at Pine Ridge, Rosebud, Cheyenne River, and Standing Rock. Overall, in the Ghost Dance War, about 300 Native Americans lost their lives, compared to between 25 and 50 U.S. soldiers and other whites. To conclude, I'll say that overall, the wars between the U.S. Army and the Sioux Nation during the period from 1854 to 1890 were marked by significant violence, bloodshed, and loss of life on both sides. These conflicts had far-reaching consequences for both Native Americans and the United States, leading to the displacement and marginalization of the Sioux Tribes and contributing to a broader history of conflict and forced assimilation between indigenous peoples and the U.S. government. And with that summary statement, I will conclude this sad story. Remember that if you would like to commission an episode on a topic of your choosing, just go to patreon.com and search for Key Battles of American History, and the instructions will be there for how to sign up to be a member of Early's Raiders. If you join at the major level or greater, eventually I will get around to writing an episode that you can commission, a mini episode for majors or a full-length episode for colonels. That's it for now. I'll be back next time with another commissioned episode from a member of Early's Raiders. Take care.
And now, a word from our sponsors.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. Key Battles of American History is a proud member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, which includes several other podcasts, including History Unplugged by Scott Rank, History of the Papacy and Organized Crime and Punishment by Steve Guerra, This American President by Richard Lim, Eyewitness History by Josh Cohen, Vlogging Through History by Chris Mowry, and The History of North America and Historical Jesus by Mark Vinette. If you haven't already, I strongly encourage you to check out these great podcasts. If you would like to support this podcast and help it to grow, there are 4 things you can do. First, you can subscribe to the podcast and leave a review on the podcast player of your choice. This helps other people to find the podcast. Ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts are especially helpful. Second, join our Facebook group, American History Fanatics, where we discuss the episodes of this podcast, as well as other topics related to American history. Third, tell as many friends as you can about the show. Consider sharing links to episodes on social media. And fourth, you can join the elite unit called Early's Raiders by going to patreon.com and searching for Key Battles of American History. There are 5 different levels of support to choose from. Each level allows you to have early access to ad-free episodes. Higher levels bring additional benefits, including bonus episodes and even the ability to commission episodes on topics of your choosing. Before I close, I would like to give a shout-out to the current members of Early's Raiders. Thanks to General Jacob Herr, Colonels Carl Archer, Mitchell Bass, Lee Beaumont, Terry Davis, Daniel Fisher, Jay Robison, Josh Simpson, and Jake Wallach. Majors Mark Bearden, Joan Belford, Chris C., Anna Concepcion Castro, Eric Chester, Bob McCullough, Melissa Mueller, Doug Pergram, and Mark Porter. Captains Jared Anderson, Ryan Apashian, Lee Barcalau, Mike C., Alex Calabrese, Carlos Calderon, Ronald Cohen, Alex Coombs, Christopher Craddock, Reed Darby, Jacob Dyke, Robbie Edwards, Larry Flowers, Kyle Foster, Richard Foster, Brian Goebel, Richard Goldblatt, Arturo Gonzalez III, Rick Hanna, Grant Holmstrom, Stephen James, Mike Leslie, Gary Lenz, Billy Malone, Craig Martin, Jose Martinez, Tim Moon, Navy Captain Retired, Nicholas Panagakos, Michael Patton, Ryan Ramones, David Santee, Scott Saunders, Michael Severino, Daniel Schumer, Scott Taylor, S.B. Tang, Jacob Thomason, Jeff Vandermeulen, and Clark Wallace. and Lieutenants Patrick Brennan, Sean Burley, Matthew Christensen, EES, Greg Gongoleski, Scott Hendricks, Who's Your Daddy, Paul Haushen, David Loaiza, Todd Mendenhall, Graham Ramsey, Tracy Stamp, Ryan Starr, Scott Taylor, Larry Elk, and Evan Westerfield. I greatly appreciate your support.
Thank you for listening to Key Battles of American History. If you liked this episode, please subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast catcher. And please be sure and spread the word about the show. If you can spare a few minutes, rate and review the show at Apple Podcasts. This greatly helps us to reach more listeners. And for show notes, maps, and further discussion, visit our website at www.keybattlesof-americanhistory.com. Thank you, and we look forward to joining you again in the next episode of Key Battles of American History.